we've heard a lot tonight, and hopefully this has helped open some people's eyes, get people thinking not just about, the issues that happen in the schools, but the possibilities of things we can do, and maybe some of the solutions and opportunities that we're not thinking about that, as some of these students have laid out tonight, are right there for us to take on. One last question that I want to open up for everyone on the panel, which is, what is it you think that adults in this community are most unaware of when it comes to racism in schools? And how can we better support you as concerned community members?
I honestly think that when we think of racism, it's very difficult for us to picture racism in our own lives, to picture racism in our own communities. And when we're talking about racism, two words have come up, institutionalized racism and microaggressions. And I think that feels like two extremes. Like, we have institutional racism, and I think of like the school to prison pipeline. I think of that, and I think of that as like a really widespread, like, national issue. And then I think about microaggressions, which can just be like one-on-one. And I think what we need to remember here is that it's not those two seeming extremes, that there's much more to the issue of racism. And what I want to speak to in just these few minutes is education and how it's critical to solving this issue. And I mean, I'm using the word solving, and it's not even doing it justice. It's how we can even begin to address this issue, because it's so deeply rooted in education. And I was reading an article from Vox the other day, and it was discussing how we teach slavery, which surprisingly enough is not taught very effectively. And it seems to me pretty ridiculous, but we don't have any sort of standard about the way that we teach slavery. And so when I'm thinking about this in terms of schools, and in terms of our curriculum, I'm thinking about the ways that we can not just say to students, like, here's what happened, but it's how we can integrate this into our English classes, how we can learn from primary sources, how we can hear the stories, how we can tie that into our history curriculum, how we can tie that into our creative classes and tie that into art projects. And when I think about racism and I think about teaching the history of racism in our country, we have to see that reflected in a series of mediums. I'm an art student, and I know that one of the most effective ways to appeal to people emotionally and mentally is through art. If we focus on racism through art, if we focus on racism through history curriculum, if we focus on racism through English, through every single subject, aside from maybe math, but we have statistics, then we can more effectively begin to address this issue. So I'm sort of going to leave it at that.
I think for me, one of the ways that I've seen most effectively to like educate, because I think, again, education is one of the biggest ways that you can combat the issue of racism, because a lot of it just stems from ignorance, is one, implementing more like comprehensive talk about racism in schools, especially at a young age, because I know personally, like, being a Black woman in America, like, there's a lot of things that I needed to know before the rest of my classmates needed to know, just because I'm Black and they're white. So there was a lot of things like the history of the N-word and why that's not a good word when people call you that, because some girl called me that. And I was like, Mom, what does this mean? And she was like, okay. So we had to talk about that, and just like little things like that where it's like you need to speak about it, because then people start using that word and don't know the history of it, and then they're just like, well, how was I supposed to know? No one ever taught me. And then another way I think also is open and honest discussions, because a lot of times in classroom settings especially, people feel afraid to ask like dumb questions, I guess, just because they don't know. So they don't want to seem stupid or like that they don't know the answers, so they just don't ask, and then they just assume things. So I know personally, like, I get a lot of questions from my friends when they're just genuinely curious about things. Like, I talked about cultural appropriation with one of my friends recently, and she was just like, I don't get it. Like, what is it? And so it was the process of explaining and then just like education, really. So I think that we just need to have more education. To kind of speak to Penelope's point, just education is really important, and just open and honest discussions, because if people don't feel like they have a chance to speak, then they never will.
I think the thing a lot of adults are either unaware of or apathetic to is how these, we talked a lot about microaggressions tonight and how, you know, these anecdotal kind of experiences have shaped us. And I think some things that a lot of people in our community don't understand is how these can affect us over time. I like to think of a person's like tolerance to these things as like a big rock. A few semi-suggestive remarks isn't gonna break you. You're a pretty strong rock. But hearing somebody say the N-word, making fun of your hair, repeatedly asking where you're really from, I mean, you can handle it. But going in day after day after day, you're putting cracks in your metaphorical rock, okay? And pretty soon, you're gonna crumble, okay? And I think that's what me and a lot of other people on this panel have experienced, is just the constant barrage of, you know, these tiny things that overall break us down and wear us down. And I think that's what a lot of adults need to understand, whether that be adults in the community or adults in the classroom, just making sure that these small things get put to an end so that they don't lead to somebody's eventual crumbling.
I am just so tired. I'm very tired of living in this town for the same exact reason that Max has. It's just the small things that slowly pick at you until you just can't handle it anymore. And I'm at a point where there's no consideration that I'm gonna stay in the state of Oregon after I graduate. There's not a single doubt in my mind that I belong somewhere else, and this is not my home. And how, like, that's awful. That's terrible. Like, this is a beautiful state with beautiful people, but how did I get to feel this way? How did I get to feel this way? And how can you change that? And I think the biggest thing that people in the audience need to realize is that it starts with the kids that say stuff to me, and they all learn it from somewhere. They learn it from the houses that they grow up in, and they learn it from the parents who thinks that things are okay when they're really not. And they learn it from this community. It's everywhere. It's in everything that is taught, everything that is just said. Kids are sponges. They absorb all information and take that in, and that becomes their character. So I guess for some concrete thing that the school could do is just, this isn't just some box you can check. Like, it's very clear to this community that there's something that needs to be done about it, and that there's a large group of people, mostly in this room, who would like some sort of change. But it's not a box, and you can create whatever councils, and you can do whatever you want that looks like you're doing something, but you have to utilize those resources in order for you to succeed. And it has to matter to you. You have to feel it. It's not something that's surface level. This is personal. This is so personal to me, and it's personal to pretty much everyone on this panel. And I think just need to care. Because there's a whole lot of not caring going on. And education is incredibly important for the student body, but if we're gonna get anywhere, then the school board and the administration, it's not simple. This problem isn't just gonna go away, and it's not gonna take a year, it's not gonna take 2 years, it's gonna take forever. And that's just something that I think people in higher up need to understand, because these problems are going to stay with me for the rest of my life, and they're going to stay with other people for the rest of their lives. And that's something that you should consider when approaching creating any sort of rules, any sort of policy, that it's going to affect, anything you do is going to affect people of color, people in minority positions. And you need to utilize, you can't be an all-white board creating some policy involving people of minority. You have to have people who know about it, people who have these experiences, because you'll never create a policy or anything that's going to be half as good as what people who have those techniques and experiences can go through. And so that's just what I have to say about that.
So I also have a prepared statement, so don't mind me from looking down. I just want to make sure that I say everything that I want to say. So when it comes to racism in schools, it's important for adults to be aware of that racist behavior is prevalent, and there's no denying that fact. And varying experiences should not undermine the perspectives of students that feel uncomfortable, unsafe, or targeted, and even if their experience heavily contrasts with the vast majority of students. Because the vast majority of students at our schools are white, and thus their experiences will likely coincide with the comfort of being white in Lake Oswego. So if Lake Oswego is going to continue to pride itself in being this renowned school district or this wonderful community, then it's essential that we don't dismiss any one experience or any one student that may indicate that there's a difference in their treatment or their opportunities or their comfort levels of any background, of any race. And for adults, specifically those that administer our buildings and in our school district, it's essential that there is an emphasis on continuous and active efforts. Students may not come forward and explicitly say that there's a problem, and some students may adamantly deny that there is a problem in the first place, but when people like us come forward and talk about our experiences, it's important to recognize that we are trying to illustrate that there's a much larger problem that one of us just can't illustrate. So when we come together, we're trying to tell you and to convey to the community that behind us there's a larger and more complicated and intricate problem, and that we want you all to be a part of.
People use their definition of being in this bubble. The white people in this community, they tend to use it as a definition to perpetuate these racist and biased norms, and like they'll think, oh, I'll get out of Lake Oswego. These students think, oh, I'll get out of Lake Oswego and it won't apply to me anymore. But the thing is, that's not the right mindset. Students need to realize that this can't be put off into the point where it's not in their hands anymore, to the point where they'll just go to another place and they'll say, oh, forget about it, because this isn't me anymore. I don't need to be associated with it. Right now, it's in our hands, and we need to make that change.
So in my culture, the majority of people in my culture wear a steel bracelet, and I'm wearing mine right now. It's really small, so you might not be able to see it. But what it is meant to symbolize is that every day, both our minds and our hands should be dedicated to doing good work. And what essentially that's meant to me is that if we see something that's wrong, it's not enough to just believe it's wrong. We must also act upon what we see is wrong. And there's a boy on my bus, and for the sake of identity, we're going to call him Sam. And Sam really liked to use the N-word a lot in every circumstance. So he'd repeatedly use it, and everyone on my bus would look uncomfortable because it's something that we all have at this point understood is wrong. But I would always be the one that'd be like, hey, Sam, why don't we not use that word? And after 9 or 10 times, Sam sat next to me on the bus, and he was like, hey, why'd you keep telling me not to use the N-word? So I explained it all to him, and I was like, there's a racial identity, there's not a use to using this. And he looked really thoughtful, and he kind of like left. And I was like, okay, at least I did my part. He listened. And then 2 months later, he ran on the bus, and he sat next to me, and he was like, Anushka, Anushka. And I was like, what? And he was like, I told someone they couldn't use the N-word today. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, you know, what you explained to me make a lot of sense, so I told like everybody. And that made every single hair comment, every single you could not be the president, every single of the hundreds of times things have happened to me and people around me worth it in that 1 second. Because this boy, Sam, has never used the N-word since. But most of the time when racist incidences happen in LO, you'll have kids coming up to you after the fact and going, hey, that was really wrong. And that's great, but it's like giving me a coupon after the expiration date. It's nice, but it's not really gonna help me. And what we need to do as a community is we need to teach our kids to spend those coupons the moment where the emotional cost is the most. We need to teach our kids to stand there and say, hey, you can't use the N-word, or hey, that girl can have her hair straight, or she can be president, or just stop saying something racist. And when we have kids like that are willing to stand up and not just look uncomfortable, we change the narrative of who we are. And one of those people is standing right there, Mr. Ron Wagner, who isn't a student, but has stood up in this community. He was one of the inaugural, can we get a round of applause for him real quick? He was one of the inaugural people to push for us having our district diversity, equity, inclusion committee. And he doesn't know how much that means to me, but he was one of the first people to say, hey, this is wrong. And maybe it didn't personally affect him, I'm not exactly sure, but he was willing to say that's wrong. And so from the perspective of me, I don't believe the next generation is our students. I believe the next generation is our adults. I believe it's you. I believe it's our educators. I believe it's our parents that have to stand up in the middle of dinner and say, hey, that on the news saying that that kid wearing a turban is a terrorist, that's not right. Or what you just said is a little racist. Let's work together to see another way we can say this. And when we teach our students to not only believe what's wrong, but also act on it, we can all be wearing our karas, maybe not in hand, but in heart.